Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Chapter 13, the Holocaust. I have been doing a lot of research on this topic over the last several weeks, as I've been doing this whole semester. Um, it's not that I'm not familiar with the Holocaust. As a historian, I have spent some time digging into it. But for this class, I certainly have gone to a deeper level. Yeah, thinking about how I've thought quite a bit about how I want to make this lecture for you guys, and this is probably a two-parter. I don't want to give some promises on the length of this, but probably be a two-parter. Hope you guys are doing good. Hope you guys are in a comfortable place, and this is an important topic, and I thought about quite a bit what I wanted to do with this lecture. Obviously, as a historian, we need to analyze what took place, be thoughtful about it, but also I wanted to have a way for you and I to be empowered and some takeaways. And I think that'll be with the second lecture. That won't be in this one. We're not going to get to that. But at the end of the second one, I want to get to what you and I can do. Because this knowledge, of course, is important for the world, for all of us. But we don't want to localize it only to that period in time. The same, whatever phrase you want to use, demons that lay behind the Holocaust tragically are still on the wing and have not gone away. There's a reason why we talk about the Holocaust. I don't want to just localize it just to these events, although obviously for these lectures we're going to focus on these events. But the warning is timeless. Humanity, sadly, has a long record of the best about humanity, and we'll talk about some of that too, some of the best, also some of the worst. And it's not isolated to just the Holocaust. The Holocaust obviously is a very dramatic and terrible example of the 20th century of an extremely dark place humanity goes to. But as you guys, a lot of you guys are junior historians yourselves, you know it's not the only time humanity has gone off the edge. But certainly has some unique characters to it and also some of the universal darkness to it too. That's something we need to always keep fresh in our minds because other places, other times, other conditions, the same demons can arise, or maybe they're already on the wing just when they have a whole series of events come together, which allows them to exponentially increase their power in the darkness. All right, so with that, how do I start this lecture on such a heavy topic? And I wanted to show kind of what I mentioned before, kind of the best and worst. And so on the left is iconic photograph, and let me make it a little smaller for you guys so you guys can read the caption there. That's one of the Eisengruppen D. That would be in the southern part of Ukraine, which, as you guys know, we spent quite a bit of time on Ukraine, and in the Ukrainian lectures we also talked about, tragically, the second highest number of victims per population of Jewish victims, not per population, but of total number of Jews. Number one in the world of Jews being killed, of course, is going to be tragically Poland. And we talked about why that is a bit already. But Ukraine is number two. And that Eisengruppen, these death units operating behind the Wehrmacht, the German front lines, conducted these mass shooting, executions, murders. And this one is in Ukraine, 1942. You can see the pit there's already full of bodies there, and that last man. The caption is "The Last Jew Alive" in Vitnitsa. Maybe that says enough about that photograph. On the right, I think you might recognize that young lady. Of course, that is Anne Frank. I imagine some of you guys probably read some of her diary in high school. Maybe it was required reading. I'm not sure what the curriculum is these days in high school. I read some in high school. In college, I went back a little bit older at your guys' age, and on my own, wasn't assigned, just on my own, read through her diary, and man, it hit me hard. She was a very talented young woman, a very expressive writer. Those of you who read her maybe already know that, but she's an extremely expressive writer. I think she would have been a writer. We'll never know, right? And that's an ultimate tragedy of the Holocaust. All these lives just cut short, so we'll never know. But I think she absolutely could have been a writer if she would have chosen to. Perhaps she would have had a different career, or we don't know. But the light shining out of the eyes of that young woman, and her excitement of life, and desire to embrace life and experiment and adventure and love and romance and family and life in general, just that energy a young person, some young people have, just the joy of life and the adventure of life. And of course, all that, as we so know so profoundly, is cut short. Um, and that really is what the Holocaust is about. We don't want to get lost on the numbers. Sometimes the numbers are so big, it's overwhelming. And the tragedy is so overwhelming, sometimes it gets depersonalized and we kind of put it into a psychological box. And that way we don't have to really process what's taking place there. Now, obviously, we did that with World War II. The total numbers of World War II, number of dead in World War II is about 72 million. Again, that number is so astronomical. We're not privileging the Holocaust over those casualties in World War II. A death is a death. But what makes the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide earlier, and similar targeted killings, but the Armenian genocide in the 20th century in Europe would be a good one. And of course, we're not talking about just Europe. And if we were in a larger class, other things happen too. Killing fields in Cambodia, you guys know. Other mass types executions. Ukraine, the Holodomor. There's many others. So, but the Holocaust, as far as sheer numbers targeting one group, although it takes place in the context of war, and the war opens up the window of opportunity to this nightmare and this horror. But it's not really about World War II in many ways. I think for Germany, as you guys know, of course, it's simply them being able to carry out what they had dreamed of prior to this. Although we'll get into the timeline and final decisions what they want to do. We'll get into that a little bit in this lecture and then more in the following lecture. But, okay. All right, let's move in. So I want to make this a bit more personal. I know that it's so easy probably to get lost here in the larger movement stuff, and we need to spend time in that. But I don't want to lose out on the individuality of each individual and what this really means. And a good introduction to that would be Daniel Mendelsohn's book, The Lost. Although there's many wonderful reads, wonderful in a very sobering kind of way on the Holocaust. But I picked up his book 5-6 years ago, and I kind of read off and on. And for some reason, this spring, I started going and listening to him talk about his book on YouTube. I mentioned that before. There's all kinds of amazing lectures on YouTube and author interviews. Some of the books I showed you guys in this class recommended to you guys. I know a lot of you guys are busy, so you probably don't have time for all those books. You guys probably see a bookshelf back there that's full of books. I got a bunch of books which you can't see over here. I got a ton of books at home. Love books. It's my passion. It's what I do to research and think and process the human drama. And so I love to read and study. And a wide-ranging, like this is the book on my desk right now, The Delusion of Satan and the Witch Trials. But there's a lot of things I'm reading simultaneously. In any case, for some reason, I don't remember where I was exactly, but got triggered for me to go back and look at that book because I hadn't read part of it, but I just started it. And I got, being a professor, and just kids and a wife and family, I got into other things, and I had started the book but had not finished it. But this spring, I'm curious about it. I thought, when I'm shaving in the morning, getting ready for work and showering and stuff, I want to listen to a Daniel Mendelsohn on YouTube talking about his book, The Lost. And to give you guys a nutshell, and when I first read this, I was grabbed by it because the book starts talking about how he was a young kid visiting relatives, I think in Florida. I think he's from New York, but he's going to Florida to visit relatives. He'd noticed some of the older Jewish relatives, Jewish, of course, looking at him and kind of whispering to each other back and forth, or not whispering, depends on the relative, and looking at him and saying, he looks like so-and-so. He really looks like so-and-so. And, of course, the young kid didn't know what to do with that. He can feel there's like a heavy weight to the words, but does not know exactly what's going on. And that's kind of the beginning of his journey of who is this person who I look like, and that leads him on a journey to find out what happened to his family. Although his parents survived, his uncle and that side of the family did not. Now, while his parents immigrated to the United States, his uncle, and you can see them right there on the right, that's not the whole family, here's the whole family, chose to stay in Poland. Now, the bitter irony is actually that side of the family had come to the United States when they were younger, and the husband and wife, I think, decided that they liked their life back in Poland. Maybe assimilating America was not what they were looking for, and although some American Jews are doing very well in America, I think they just maybe felt like they'd be starting over. And they had already a good thing going on in Poland, and so they go back. And of course, you guys kind of know what's coming, right? And in the late 30s, and as things get worse and worse, the family realizes we want to get out. Now they're in Poland, but they can feel the rumblings of what's coming, and they begin writing letters to the family, help us get out. And Daniel Mendelsohn, his family, his side of the family, and I said is trying to, but there's only so much they can do. And but he found some of these letters addressed to his parents and his grandparents, asking for help. And knowing that probably families doing all they can. But long story short, the United States is not letting in many Jewish refugees. Despite what they do, the family is not able to get their relatives out, this family out from Poland. The Germans arrive, and they're killed in a pogrom. And when he was younger, most of the family did not know how they died. They didn't know they did die. Maybe had some general details, but not know exactly. And as Daniel Mendelsohn gets older, and in his book he talks about this, he decides to investigate. We don't know exactly what happened to the family. We know they were killed in the Holocaust, but we don't really know. And and you wonder for all of them, right? And so by the way, this was taken years before. By the time the Holocaust took place, I think one of the daughters was married or dating. Two of the daughters were teenagers. One of the girls was a bit younger. I think the three sisters, I think what it was, or four. He decides to go back, and maybe he can try and investigate what happened to them. And he would travel several times to Poland, and he digs and studies, and being a scholar himself, he's a professor of literature, begins to dig and study, try to figure out what happened to them and investigate. And eventually, I'm not going to tell you what happened because I recommend that book to you guys, but eventually he does find out, and I'll just share one very personalized and amazing and chilling detail is I mentioned how he went to the village where they are from. He was actually able to go to the house, so the house where they would have been was still intact. It was still there. And he looked around the house, and amazingly, as he looked around the house, he actually found one of the hiding locations that the family probably surely would have used, and that hiding location still existed. So, and him getting into that location and thinking what would have been like to be hiding here, hoping the Germans or the local Ukrainian police force and auxiliaries would not find you. Now, obviously, eventually they were found, although I think not in that house. I think they were taken out of there. But seeing those hiding places in the actual house itself, where his relatives had been thinking, my relative, my loved one, of course, he never knew them, but his family certainly did. They imagine that in those locations, hoping to breathe quietly, calm their heart rates in case the house is being searched, to save hold on their lives. So I'd recommend that book to you guys. And he eventually finds out and tracks down what happens every time. Remember, they weren't all killed at the same time period. There's different stories kind of for each one. What happened to the whole family? Well, the whole family did die. And his journey to understand that and process that. And you see a search for 6 out of 6 million, the subtitle. Again, trying to say that 6 million is just too big a number. But let me tell you my family's history, what it did to my family. So, okay. Now, again, this is a really big topic, and I mulled over quite a bit how to talk about it with you guys. And so I tried to break this up into maybe digestible pieces, and here's the way I did that. So I want to give you guys the context for anti-Semitism. We've done that a little bit in this class already. We talked about that with Ukraine some, and the Pale Settlement and so forth. So I'll move quickly over that, but the first era I want to talk about when we think of the context of the Holocaust to come is ancient anti-Jewish movements, which really begins in the early Christian era all the way to the 19th century. And again, I'll move kind of quickly over that, but I do want to talk about that because it's important to give you context for where the Nazi ideology emerges out of, the context it comes from. The second part is going to be modern anti-Semitism and Nazi ideology. That's going to be late 19th century up to World War II, or close to World War II. Number 3, the Nazis in power. That'd be escalating assaults on the Jewish community, but that'd be prior to World War II. Actually, Nazis in power, maybe prior to World War II. On the fly here. In fact, actually, let's make it more specific, really. This will be 1933 to 1939. There we go. Okay, so here. And maybe the highlights for you guys. This is important. So let me highlight it. There we go. There we go. Okay. And let me make it a little bigger for you guys. Not that big. Okay, here we go. Not quite. We're getting there. Okay, that's better. Yeah, okay, I think we're good now. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, here we go. So, all right. And then World War II, that would be the German invasion of the East. That's the beginning of the mass killings and forced relocation to ghettos, further planning, further measures against the Jews. And that'd be from June 41 to December 39. And actually, maybe I'd even wouldn't go, no, I'm going to change that too. So on the fly here, you can see I've been, even since I wrote some of this, continue to do research and thinking about it. Let's change this. That's invasion of Poland, 1939. There we go. 1939 to December 41 is the next period, and that's when, for the first time, you begin to have mass killings. Now, there are certainly killings once the Nazis are in power in Germany. There's murders. Some of the Jewish leaders sent to Auschwitz, which is not technically yet a death camp, but certainly was a place you would not want to be in. Good chance you'll die while you're there. There certainly been killings of Jews, but there had not been the beginning of what I call a mass campaign of murder. That does not begin until the invasion of Poland in 1939, especially when Germany invades Russia and the Russian territories. That would be in June of 41. That's why the June 41 is there. But and that'd be up to December 41. And then from December 41, again, there's no perfect date exactly, but from December 41 until the end of World War II, that's when the terrible apparatus of death, the machine death, really kicks into even in that next higher year, and that would be with the systematic murder and death camps. From September 39 to 41, you have mass shootings, and you have many that die in that. Probably 1.5 million Jews are killed from the invasion of Poland up to December 41. So it's not that there's not a mass campaign of death, but it had not become the machinery of the death camps. And that would begin following December 41 and really get going in 42, but up to the end of World War II. And that'd be the last part, which is called Final Solution. In this lecture, we're not going to do the last two. We're going to work on up to the Nazis in power. Then we'll stop this lecture. So let's get to the ancient world. And I'll do this quickly because we did talk about this in the previous lecture already. So this next little bit, the first part of this is going to be very brief, hit a couple highlights before we move on, because we did talk about this in the previous lecture on Ukraine. But as you guys know, there's a long, tragic history of tensions and violence between the early Christians, early Jews. I'm not going to get into that, although you can see in front of you, and I'll take a moment to pause that. You could read through that. You could also go back and look at the previous lecture on Ukraine, anti-Semitism in Ukraine, because in that lecture I did go into more detail on this. Just want you to know the early Jewish community persecuted the early Christian community. The Romans, of course, are the ultimate authority in the area. They get involved. They begin to go after the Christians, as you guys know, and that puts the Jewish and Christian community even farther apart, because the Jews would quickly step away from the Jews who are being persecuted by the Romans. Later on, the Jews themselves revolt against Rome, and you get a reverse where Christians separate themselves from Jews, saying, look, I'm not the one who's going against Rome. That's the Jews over there. I'm a Christian. And then eventually the Christians into the Roman Empire come into power. And once in power, they begin persecuting and forcing their religious beliefs against the Jewish minority. But now the Christians have the power of the Roman state, if they so choose, to go after the Jewish minority. Again, there's much more to that, of course, but that bad blood early on between both sides, frankly, at times persecute each other. Jews weren't in power long enough to do it for a long time period, but they did start initially. When I say start, I'm not saying in any way that justifies the horror to come. I'm just simply saying that historically that's what happened. But Jewish dominance and anger for the Jewish majority over the centuries into the medieval world leads to certainly intolerance, sometimes outright persecution. Jews are often forced to flee from European countries. They're expelled often. There'll be pogroms, violence against them. When natural disasters strike, for example, the Black Death in Europe, Jews are often blamed for that. They're often a scapegoat for other societal issues, one kind or another. During the Crusades, the Crusaders on their way to Europe, well, I should say some branches of the Crusader armies as they're traveling on to Europe, massacred Jews on the way there. So the New World is not a good time for the Jews in many ways. It's a difficult time in many cases. Intolerance, at times riots, scapegoating, etc. And so that forces many Jews to either because they have to or because they want to flee from persecution. Europe, again, some are outright expelled. Some go into the Islamic world, as you see here from this map right here. See the expulsion from Spain, from Portugal, from England, France, other areas. And because of the intolerance, the violence, the exile, many of the Jews, as you know, back into North Africa or the Muslim world, or as you guys know from our lecture on Ukraine, many will go to Poland, which in the world, Poland is one of the most open, perhaps the most open European nation and most tolerant nation toward Jews in Europe, which leads to there, and then Ukraine, which was controlled by the post-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at least large portion of Ukraine were up. A significant number of Jews immigrating to these places. All right. Now, what I did not do in the previous lecture, now I'll slow down just a little bit here, is, and let me highlight this for you guys because you want to know this. During the medieval world, there was a whole series of very terrifying, intense conspiracy theories about what the Jewish community was doing. Perhaps the most infamous and blood-curdling of these was the conspiracy theory that Jews, in order to celebrate Passover properly and to bring about certain long-cherished Jewish events, for example, to enable the Jews to return to Jerusalem and triumph in the city of David, the city of Judaism, to return there, that they needed to kidnap a young Christian boy, and that they would take this young Christian boy and they'd ritually bleed him, kill him, and drain out all the blood in his body, and this would be used in performance of Passover rituals, even Passover food, in order to bring about this kind of divine Jewish blessing to restore Judaism to its natural place. But obviously what it involves is a ghoulish kidnapping, murder, and then draining all the blood out of this murdered young Christian boy's body for their dark Jewish rituals. Now, of course, this is complete garbage. This has nothing to do with reality. But this is a very impactful and important conspiracy narrative. I can't keep saying conspiracy, right? But that's not oftentimes how it was interpreted in the medieval world, as you guys understand. This is considered fact. So the artwork you see in there, for example, this is actually on the left comes from the alleged crucifixion of William of Norwich, who was a young Jewish, a teenager, I think 12, trying to do the math there, 12-year-old, who allegedly was crucified and bled by some Jews in England, again, for this Passover dark renewal, Jewish power, returning to Jerusalem, and needing Christian blood from Christian body to do this. That would be in England. You see in 1144 when the story first emerges. Another quite prominent one is of a young Italian Christian boy. That's one you see depicted in the middle, who similarly is kidnapped and he's bled, and all his blood is taken out as he's murdered. And again, for the same idea with a Jewish ritual. That came out in the late 1400s. And the one on the right is of a Russian young boy, allegedly, you guys know the drill now, same story, who was kidnapped and murdered or tortured and all the blood drained out of his body by a Jewish man for the exact same reason. Now, these ghoulish stories, and they're very salacious, you guys can see, but these are widely accepted by many in Europe, in the Christian world. Not everybody bought these stories. Even at the time, there's people that say, no, that did not happen. We don't buy it. So even then, there are people saying this doesn't make sense to me. The evidence of these alleged crimes and atrocities is lacking. It's a lot of hearsay evidence and so forth. Be that what it may, a significant number of people in Europe absolutely believe these things. It scares them, it terrifies them, and enrages them at the Jewish minority potentially around them. Stories like this, by the way, oftentimes would prompt pogroms, or a priest might get up and preach a very angry sermon against the pestilence of the Jews and community, and now we hear this young boy has been murdered. You can imagine how perhaps angry and outraged his congregation gets of this already marginalized community. That could lead to violence, oftentimes mob violence, against the local Jewish community. So whenever a young Christian boy is found murdered, and by the way, I don't doubt perhaps these young people were murdered. That probably is the case. But the idea there was this sinister Jewish plot behind it, that the Jews secretly do in common, it's not unusual. That is very sinister. Of course, it's not true. But does not matter in the context that many Europeans believe it is true, and that leads to additional anger toward the Jews, besides the original libel, Christ killer of God, deicide. But now you see them actively preying on the innocent young Christian community, in this case, these young boys who were killed, allegedly. Okay, so what does that mean? Early anti-Semitism is violently intolerant of the Jewish religion. That goes back to the early, Christian period and time when the Christianity becomes official religion of Rome. But also you have these various anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, and there's others too. But I just told you the most prominent one's called the blood libel. So that is pulling in the medieval world, and that is fueling a lot of the anger toward the Jews. There's other factors as well too. I'm not going to get into all of those. But it's not unusual to have Catholic priests, and later on, after the Protestant Reformation, Protestants, for example, like Martin Luther and others, that make very strong statements against the Jews. So that means often deep prejudice, outright hatred, violent riots, expulsion from European nations, as I talked about. Forced conversions are also quite common. I mentioned dark rumors, conspiracy theories. Yep. All those. Dark rumors would be like, for example, the plague is because of them, etc. Now, following the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, a lot of these very exclusionary policies, the more extreme forms of violence, at least in Western Europe, died down. It did not go away with the Enlightenment, but it did die down. So the Jewish community began to have hope that perhaps we can enter mainstream European society, no longer be a targeted minority, forced to acquire different dress and clothing, socially excluded, frequently vulnerable to the whims of the community and the church and the rulers, excluded from various professions. And again, I didn't go through all of the medieval exclusion of Jews and the jobs they could not have, and often being forced into banking or holding taverns and so forth. There's a lot there, but I don't want to make this lecture too long, so that's probably about enough on the medieval world. And I'll go through this quickly because this is actually a cut and paste from earlier notes on Ukraine and Poland. I just want to mention this again because it's so important of why so many Jews were in Poland and Ukraine when the Holocaust takes place. Again, just very briefly, as you guys know, they had fled persecution and exile and found safe haven in the larger Poland-Lithuanian kingdom. So that's why so many were there. But once Russia took Poland and Ukraine, this large Jewish minority now is in the Russian Empire. The Russian historically was quite anti-Semitic. They did not want Jews to circulate freely inside Russia, and you guys know it leads to what's called the Pale of Settlement, which is its own exclusion, where the Russian Empire tries to keep the Jews secluded to those areas where they were when they were first conquered and brought into the Russian Empire. But again, they don't want them circulating throughout larger Russia. So they're held here. By the way, there's a side note, but just going back into Ukrainian history just for a second, Putin's claim again that, somehow there's no separation between Russia and Ukraine. This is one more example of that. Historically, it's not true even in Russia's own eyes, because clearly the Pale Settlement demonstrates in the Russian eyes, Ukraine is not the core heart of Russia. Now, of course, we want it. It's very valuable, and we want the farmland and the breadbasket there, resources, freshwater ports, we want that stuff. But that's not the heart of traditional Russia, thus it being in the Pale Settlement, as you guys know, where Jews can live, but we don't want them crossing the boundaries into traditional Russia. Okay. Let's keep moving here. So modern anti-Semitism and Nazi ideology, this would be 19th century to World War II. So now, up till now, the exclusion of Jews, intolerance, the violence, sometimes the death and massacres, a way a Jew could avoid a lot of that would be to convert. So it would not be uncommon, for example, in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition, when periodically the Spanish nobility, under the pressure of some official in the Catholic Church, decided it's time to teach the Jews a lesson. Again, usually prompted by some rumor of a murder, either actual or not. When I say actual, I don't mean the blood libel, that's what happened, but someone's found dead. The rumor circulates what happened to them, especially if it's a young boy who's killed. It doesn't take too long before the rumor mill gets out of control. Pretty soon, it's a blood libel story again. So if that takes place, say, in Spain during their Inquisition, it'd not be uncommon for a priest to give a fiery sermon, for the crowd to be enraged, the Jewish community, and to rush to the Jewish part of town and to give them an ultimatum, which is either you convert to Christianity or we kill you now. And of course, then the Jewish community has a terrible choice there, and some would convert at that moment. If they converted at that moment, they would survive. If they did not, they may be murdered shortly. Okay, the reason I mentioned that is, at that time period, Judaism was not seen as a racial thing. It's a belief system. If you gave it up, you can be a citizen like us. You can embrace Christianity. You can be us. Now, we might be suspicious of you. We need to track you and follow you, make sure your conversion is genuine. But if your conversion is genuine, then you're fine. But after all, Jesus and the disciples were Jews. Now, they became Christian, but they were Jews. So but that's going to change here. There's a big turning point here. So we get into what's called scientific racism. You guys will write that term down. This is going to emerge as a long-term consequence of Enlightenment thinking. But Enlightenment thinking has many positive qualities. But there's more thought put in the scientific world, various Enlightenment scholars all the way from there into the 19th century begin to study humanity and the aspects of humanity, and try to categorize humanity scientifically and examine differences and so forth. Some of that's probably natural, but for the sake of this lecture, though, some of it gradually moves in a very dark way, and I'd say, now objectively a non-scientific way, but at the time it appeared very scientific, and you had many leading mind science arguing this. Essentially, scientific racism is the races inherently have essential, immutable characteristics, and those are based on race. Not surprisingly, racism, in our modern use of the term, is going to influence this very subjective analysis of what, quote, is racial characteristics. And you have various European thinkers, because Europe, in the 19th century, is the most dominant, in the United States, of course, culture, economy in the world in that time period, to imagine themselves as the pinnacle of human development, and other areas, other races, obviously, as they would perceive it, have some kind of flawed makeup, and it'd be a racial makeup that's flawed. Social Darwinism is a part of this. It's not the only factor, but it'd be an example of this. And you don't need to know as the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. He's just one of many, by the way. So I'm not trying to put this on him, but he would be one who had talked about, how do we separate out? And he talked about the white race, perhaps we're being more refined because we're in this northern climate, which is cold a lot of time. But you argue it makes you be active. If you're in the temperate climate, say Hawaii, they just lay around all day because that's the island life, and they don't accomplish a whole lot because it's so warm and comfortable. But the cold Nordic weather forces you to be active, to survive. That very activity, though, racially helps you develop a much more active response to life in which creativity and science and all these things emerge out of. I'm not going to get into all that, but you can see the emergence, though, of certain races having these built-up characteristics, other races not so well. And of course, they get much more developed and much darker. A whole series of thinkers have come that way. The man there in the middle, that's Eugene Fisher, and he'd be a Nazi professor of anthropology, eugenics. And he's going to take a much earlier kind of partial formation. Of course, not just him. There's a whole, there's probably 50 guys I could have put in here. But in this case, having a much more, when I say developed, I don't mean scientifically coherent today, but subjectively constructed theory. This much more elaborate, like which are the good, highly evolved races, which ones are profoundly inferior and a genetic threat to the body of the superior races. You can see on the right, that's an exhibition called The Eternal Jew. You can see an example of these stereotypical Jewish features. Again, and they would argue those Jewish features are determinative. It's not just that you have, again, within that context, a big nose, but that big nose signifies your genetic spiritual soul. So it's not simply, again, some physical characteristic. No, it represents the soul of who you are, what you're capable of. And obviously, in the Nazi context, is a very dark interpretation of that racial soul. Now, why does that matter? Because in the context of this, it doesn't matter whether you're practicing actively the Jewish religion or not. It's a DNA thing. And the Jewish DNA is corrupted and a cancer on the potentially on the body of the pure Aryan race. Give you guys a minute. You guys want to highlight this right here, so I'll give you guys a minute to work on that. But scientific racism, at that time, again, we call it pseudoscientific, but at the time period, they did not consider pseudoscientific. Excuse me. Pseudoscientific is how we describe it today, which is junk science. But at the time period, you had very talented scientists saying this is science, cutting edge science. So we currently say pseudoscience, but that's not how they viewed it. And they tried to describe that as empirically true, based on the evidence that we subjectively collected and subjectively reviewed and analyzed. We like to imagine science is strictly an absolute logical, dispassionate profession. No. People are people. They have their biases too. Now, I know sometimes they're better at this, but you had very, very bright individuals. A wonderful example showing how science can be quite biased. You had very talented scientists. Some of the best of this era coming up with this stuff. And that leads to a whole series of dark things. For example, the German, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture very briefly, but the German colonization in today's Namibia. The Germans had what they consider problems with their colonial subjects, the Herero people and the Nama people. The Germans decided, both because it was good for the Germans, but that these people were genetically inferior, taking up a lot of good grazing space. Some of them were cattle rustlers and so forth. For a variety of reasons, the Germans viewed them as in the way. There had been a revolt by these people against German control. Not surprised because German control was them as ferocious. So no wonder the Nama people and the Herero people are revolted against the Germans. So Germans felt that this revolt was going too far. They moved to crush it. That's not unusual. Most colonial empires do something similar. That's not what makes it special. What makes it special and terrible, by special and terrible, is the Germans decided to eliminate them entirely. They decided to conduct genocide against these two peoples or tribes or nations. And again, the justification was, besides the fact that we're annoyed by them and they're not the colonial subject we want them to be, and they've been resisting us, and there's been some pushback and some violence against us. But they justified it by saying they're in the way, but more than just in the way, they're a genetic subspecies of humanity. They're inferior. So essentially, they cannot and will not ever contribute something to larger humanity because they're an inferior branch of humanity. So we're doing the world a favor, and obviously ourselves a favor here in Namibia, by eliminating them in their entirety. Why should they be taking up food space? Why should they be eating? Why should they be raising cattle, causing us problems? because we don't need them. We could never interact with them as equals because they're not equal, because they're subhuman. Similarly, the German T4 euthanasia program. This will play an important role in the Holocaust too, as we'll see here in just a minute. But now, again, aligned with this eugenics, which we have not really gone into eugenics, but eugenics is to proactively clean the gene pool, not simply wait for things. And usually, eugenics means clean your internal gene pool. There'll be others too. But eugenics implies you do not allow the inferior human beings to continue to reproduce and create more inferior human beings who will contribute nothing to humanity and are simply an eater and drinker and are taking up room, being. You don't need more of them. So the mentally handicapped, certain kinds of disabled, people with very serious mental health issues, etc., are considered unuseful to society. They're a burden on society, and God forbid they reproduce and produce more of them. We don't need more idiot savants. We don't need more severely handicapped people. We don't need more autistic people, etc., etc. And so the T4 program was a German euthanasia campaign to eliminate those groups who they considered a drag on Germany. Probably at least 18,000 of those people were killed in this castle here in the background, oftentimes gassed. So you guys are already familiar with the gassing. This was taking place, and this is before the death camps, as you guys know. There's already some experiments with gas, and they use other things too. So it wasn't just gas, but that was kind of part of things they're experimenting with very early on that play a very sinister role later in the Holocaust. Yeah, maybe talk about social dramas a little bit more in the Holocaust. By the way, the United States participated in this a little bit through forced sterilizations here in America. I won't get off on that tangent, but this interpretation of social Darwinism would play a major role both in World War I. We're not going back to that, but World War II, and certainly in genocide in Africa and Europe, as perceiving them, among other things, as being a subspecies. And of course, as you know, in the context of the Holocaust, that of course would apply to the Jews. All right, modern anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, both old and new, and racial judgments. So, I mentioned that blood libel in the medieval world, that has a very long reach. On the left there, you see a depiction on a stone medallion in Italy, and on a building there, and it shows a young Christian, looks like an infant there, who's being strangled and being bled by some Jews. That is still on the building today. I would hope they have plaques on there saying this is a piece of anti-Semitic history, and we're keeping it here as a landmark of history of this dark time period that came out of the medieval world. But it didn't stay in the medieval world, because the next piece you look at right here comes out of Ukraine in the 1910s, and it shows a dead young boy. Take a look at this, and the caption reads, "Christians, take care of your children. It will be the Jews' Passover on March 17." That's the 1910s in the Ukraine saying, this young dead boy, be careful. There's a Jewish holiday, Passover coming up, and you guys know, based on the blood libel, they would not use blood. They wouldn't use the word libel, though, because libel means it's not true, right? The blood truth that Jews do this kind of thing. We've known that for hundreds and hundreds of years back in the world. This is the plague that Jews do. That's in the Ukraine. And as you guys know from my lecture on Ukrainian history, a significant number, well, significant, I don't want to put like too big a number, but there was significant local collaboration with the Eisengruppen in Ukraine from local Ukrainians to come out and participate. Same thing in Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, etc., of locals coming out and participating in the early days of the Holocaust with the Eisengruppen, beating Jews to death, rounding them up, transporting them out to the execution site, sometimes doing the actual killing themselves, and these would be locals. And the context of that is, again, this is in 1910s in Ukraine. You have something out coming out like this, warning the local population, this is what Jews do. Passover's almost here. Keep an eye on your kids. Imagine how chilling that would be if you're a parent that time period and you have no outside sources of information. Now, obviously, not all Ukrainians believe that kind of stuff, right? Even then, some Ukrainians are like, that's garbage. We know it's garbage. but a certain number are going to believe that kind of stuff. On the right, you see some of that kind of race science, scientific racism. That's by Brunnenberger. He's a German anthropologist, ethnologist, explorer, and he's traveling the world. And you see he has little calipers out there measuring this man's skull. By the way, his conclusion is not going to be a good one. Just in case you're wondering, he's not going to say, this guy may be a different skull shape the guy, but he's fully human like I am, with same level of God-given dignity and value to humanity, regardless of his education, whatever, but his core humanity is the same as mine. That is not going to be his conclusion. As you can imagine, his conclusion is going to be much, much darker. This is an inferior subspecies of humanity. You can see later on, he'll play an important role with SS identifying Jews. Well, look at this last part right here. And later helped select human subjects to be killed to create an anatomical study of a collection of Jewish skulls. He just died in 2009. Wow. Yeah. Okay. All right. More of what's going on. Some of these old conspiracy theories, but now in Germany. On the left there, you see, it's a little hard to see here, but you see an illustration of some stereotypical cartoonized Jews, and they're collecting blood draining down from these kind of vast assemblage of Christian kids, and blood draining down. And that would be in 1934 in the German Nazi, it's not officially a Nazi publication, but Nazi-inspired publication, Der Stürmer. That book in the middle is the Learned Protocols of Elders of Zion, which allegedly is the Jewish blueprint to take over the world. Now, it's completely falsified, it has no basis in reality, but that is the perception of this falsified document. It's a very common conspiracy theory, which I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into in this lecture, but that title there, the Secrets of the Wise Men of Zion, or Protocols Learned of Zion, however you want to describe that book, is going to be very impactful around the world, and it's still alive and unwell on the internet today. So it's repeated in the Islamic world today. This book was fabricated, came out of Russia probably in the 1840s, 1850s, but it purports to be this the notes, this blueprint of the sinister Jewish plan to take over the entire world. And you see similarly that cartoon on the right coming out of France in the turn of the century, this kind of sinister Jewish figure, the Rothschilds, this banking family, with this world and this kind of ghoulish monster claws that's grabbing a hold of the world. There's that book, Protocols Learned of Zion. You guys want to know that, so take a minute to write this down and just highlight a part of it. Now, why does all this matter? So this sinister view of the Jews still coming out of the medieval world, that the blood libel and killing our kids. And now let's combine scientific racism as well, too, which means it's no longer simply a Jew is a Jew because he believes in the Jewish faith. No, it's a racial thing. Translation, he can never be an un-Jew. She can never be an un-Jew because it's genetic. It's on a cellular level. A very threatening cellular level, but there's no possibility of like they convert and no longer be a threat to us religiously. No, that's not the issue anymore. It's a racial thing. They're Jew by race. Translation, they can never escape who they really are. I'm not going to take time to go into this one. I just mentioned it briefly. The Dreyfus Affair, we talked about this way back at the start of the semester. An example of in France, this Jewish army officer being accused of betraying France for the benefit of the Germans, and he's very famously tried and stripped of his military uniform and degraded. You see his swords being broken. He's eventually sent off to Devil's Island. Turns out, of course, he's simply a scapegoat. He was not guilty at all of treason to France. He was a loyal French soldier. Eventually, he would be brought back to France and pardoned. Actually, I don't know if he got pardoned. Pardon means you did it, but they give you grace, basically. I don't believe he was pardoned. I think that they overturned his conviction. I'll have to go back and look. Now, there were some brave people who defended him. Émile Zola, the great French writer, would very strongly condemn what had taken place. The reason I mention that is we need more of that. Brave individuals stand up and say, this is nonsense, it's worse, it's toxic, it's cancer for our society. And Emile Zola is a good example of someone who's seen the insanity of anti-Semitism, what it did specifically to Dreyfus, and realizing how profoundly it's a violation of French democracy, the French rule of law, French due process, French acceptance of humanity, etc., and very aggressively accused, and is influential in doing that, and helps with his publication and strong stand to get his case, the case we looked at, and ultimately helps with getting Dreyfus's freedom and exoneration. Okay, so we're getting long here, so maybe I should stop right here. I don't want to make this lecture any longer than it is, so we'll get into the Nazis in power, but that's going to be with a follow-on lecture. That's enough for this one. So hope this has been a good journey for you guys. There's much more to come, but we should stop right here. So I wish you guys all a good day, and we'll see you with the next one. Take care, everybody.